can a desire for return on investment really coexist with a clinical model that doesn't necessarily share that as its sole focus and initiative?
We have to be at the forefront in cutting costs and cost efficiency.
You always have to look and see, are you losing control of what you've always been good at doing?
The physicians really have to drive the overall clinical experience in order to make sure that the quadruple aim isn't lost.
When it comes to cardiovascular care on the organizational level, MedAxiom understands the challenges your program is facing. Welcome to MedAxiom HeartTalk, the podcast where thought leaders come together for one ultimate goal: to continually transform cardiovascular care for all. MedAxiom HeartTalk starts now.
I'm Melanie Lawson, a journalist in Jacksonville, Florida, and host of MedAxiom HeartTalk. In today's episode, we will examine the influx of private equity in cardiovascular healthcare and how one size certainly does not fit all. I am thrilled to introduce our 5 guests today. We have an array of perspectives here. Ann Honeycutt is the Executive Director of Virginia Cardiovascular Specialists in Richmond and serves on MedAxiom's Board of Managers. Larry Sobal is CEO of the Heart and Vascular Institute of Wisconsin in Appleton, Wisconsin. We also have Dr. Rick Snyder, the president of HeartPlace in Dallas, Texas, also a practicing interventional cardiologist. Dr. Dinesh Pubbi is a founding member of First Coast Heart and Vascular Center in Jacksonville, Florida, also the director of electrophysiology. And last but not least, we have Joe Sasson, EVP of Ventures and Chief Commercial Officer at MedAxiom. I told you we had a fabulous panel today. So welcome to the podcast, Ann, Larry, Dr. Snyder, Dr. Pubbi, and Joe. Appreciate you all making time for us today.
Thanks, Melanie. Happy to be here.
Thank you, Melanie. Look forward to it.
Nice to meet you.
Honored to participate.
Yes, thank you again. So all of our guests, I have to say, have extensive experience and expertise in cardiovascular healthcare. So please check out their full bios in the episode notes. But first, we want to give you the hard questions. So we ask all our Heart Talk guests, why did they get into the healthcare industry? And did they ever have an aha moment? So Ann, let's start with you. What was that aha moment for you?
Gosh, well, mine's sort of easy. I had a father who was a physician and a mother who was a nurse, and she ran Fairfax County Health Department for years. And so I started off very early doing home visits and thought this is something I really could enjoy doing for the rest of my life, and ended up leaving home health and getting into the hospital world. And now I've been blessed to be with the physician group for well over 22 years.
Yeah, you must have nailed it first try. Larry, what about you? How did you get into healthcare?
When I was in college, I had a professor that was really a great mentor to me, and he was listening to me struggle over what I wanted to do with my life. And he introduced me to the local hospital administrator and arranged for me to shadow him for a couple of days. And that really turned the light on to me that there's this whole profession in healthcare outside of being a clinician. And that CEO actually convinced me that you need to set your sights on graduate school and get a graduate degree in health administration or business administration and go down that road, which is what I did.
Wow, that's awesome. That access really did shape who you are now. Dr. Pubbi, let me ask you, how did you get into this industry? What was your aha moment?
Yes, of course. So my inclination towards the medicine started when very young age, my father had a heart attack at the age of 30s. And where I was at that time, there was not even enough services as a basic cardiology services, which can be provided for him to even, to go through the regular procedures or whatever that needed to be done. So I had to struggle through them to get him to the next levels. And that prompted me that, okay, to help the humanity as well as to myself and to my other colleagues, I got to get into the medicine. And that prompted me all the way to the cardiology and into EP.
Wow, he was so young too.
Yeah, it's very young age.
Wow. Dr. Snyder, what was your aha moment?
For me, it wasn't so much a single moment, but a single series of moments. I, as a young child, had a series of varied illnesses, Haemophilus influenza, pneumonia. I had an incident where I tripped and spilled milk bottles and glass. We used to get it delivered at that time, and had a bad injury where I cut every nerve and tendon in my hand, and had a good surgeon and was able to use it again. So that prompted me to go to be the pre-med route. And I confirmed that when I was an anesthesia technician in high school and in college in my local hospital working in the OR, and got to watch them very closely and intimately do bypass surgery. And that really got me hooked about cardiology as a profession.
Wow. Personal experience. You know, all of you all have something that happened. And for you, Dr. Snyder, a series of events that certainly paved the way beautifully for where you are right now. Well, let's dive into this very, very important conversation. And M&A attorney Roger Strode says our aging population, physician shortages, and fragmentation in the industry are why cardiology practices have become what he called the new darling of private equity investment. Now, at a recent CV Transforum, chair of the MedAxiom Board of Managers, Dr. Howard Walpole said this: private equity companies who have very deep pockets are coming in and buying cardiology practices. I'm not saying it's a good thing or a bad thing. I just want you to have all the right people advising you and all the information you need to make a good decision. And that is what today is all about. Our intention for today's Heart Talk is to provide you with a broad spectrum of perspectives on private equity so that you can make an informed decision if and when the time comes and you all have to make a decision. So we have a very diverse group today that is going to delve into this conversation. So first, let's set the scene with a round robin sharing, a brief overview of your ownership model, also what role private equity plays in this, if any at all. So let's start with Dr. Snyder, if you could talk about this.
Well, it's interesting we're having this conversation today. If you asked me this question a week ago, I would have given you a different answer. And for just full transparency, we have just completed our private equity experience. And as of Friday, we are now a member of U.S. Heart and Vascular, one of the more prominent ones that is engaged in the industry right now. And for transparency, Roger Strode was actually our attorney that got us over the finish line over this last process. But for us, we did not have an epiphany moment about this. We didn't wake up one day and think a capital partner could be important until we took a couple of meetings with some groups, really more than anything else, just to be courteous because we knew them. But when we learned about the model and the real emerging things that are developments in healthcare, what we call the great outmigration away from hospitals to the lower cost sites of service, RPMs, hospital at home, but also this once in a lifetime transformation from fee for service to value-based care, that provides the opportunity for independent practices which are uniquely situated to benefit in that setting. And when you actually look at it, you know, cardiovascular disease, $1 out of 7 of national healthcare expenditures, cardiovascular disease, we currently spend $4.3 trillion in this country. We cannot afford the healthcare that we're buying now. By 2030, it's going to be $6.7 trillion. So we have to be at the forefront in cutting costs and cost efficiency. We now have those tools to do that. And really, as an independent provider, being able to choose the site of service, the low-cost sites of service, and really leverage the value-based reimbursement pathways provided that opportunity for us. So after we took those meetings and learned this model, more than anything else, we really looked at this as we need to learn how to compete with this model. And really, for the first 6 months, it was about why would we ever do this? And then finally, we came to that aha moment last year. Why would we not do this? And when we had a strategy session with our group, we needed to determine what's the vision for our group? Where do we see ourselves in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years? And once we define that, we asked the question, does it make sense to have a capital partner? And when we did answer that in the affirmative, that pretty much decided who that capital partner for us would be. We want to be the high cost, the high quality, low cost provider in the area. And we wanted not only to survive, but thrive as an independent group. And we felt that made a lot of sense.
All right. Thank you for that explanation. Dr. Pubbi, let me ask you similar questions. Can you describe the PE model that you have with Novocardia?
Of course. I echo Dr. Snyder's sentiments. We had the same issue about the private equity group was everybody has the same question. Should I or shouldn't I? And why should I? We explored this model for a long time, not just the private equity, but the shared model, the other models, to look into and see what suits us and what doesn't. Like we wanted to have a good quality. We did not want it to be controlled by the people. We have an independent practice, and we wanted to keep a model which would suit our needs while giving a good quality and resources for us to help the community as well as provide a low-cost care to them. Value-based care is on the market. We know that it's going to happen. It hasn't happened much in cardiology. We see that happening in orthopedic, happening in other practices, but cardiology is on the forefront at this point, using a lot of resources. So when we had a talk with Novocardia, we had a talk with multiple other partners, and for us, the first thing which helped us to make a decision was that we were talking not to the businessman, but we were also talking to the physicians and the cardiologists. So Novocardia was run at that point, or still is, by the two cardiologists, and that helped us made the life much easier because now you talk the clinical sense, they understand the scope of your clinical practice, and they know what it takes to build a better value-based care as well. Along with that, they were very heavy on the value-based care side, and that's an upcoming model. So you have to get it ready whenever it comes to you. You got to make sure you have everything there for you. The model for which we have with Novocardia, we wanted to have every company has a different model. Every group has a different model the way it runs. We wanted to make sure when we have the model, we have our own governance, that we still are capable of making the decisions at our practice level. We wanted to make sure that we have a say in the day-to-day activities. We didn't want to let go of the day-to-day say because that's what it took us that long to build that model. We wanted to make sure our schedules and the physician schedule doesn't get affected. Along with that, we wanted to make sure that we have a skin in the game. So for our model, we have still some of the partners have equity in the company as well. So it's not completely run by the private equity. It is a shared model, which makes accountable for both the private equity as well as the physician involved to make the company grow better. So that way we can have a final goal.
Okay, thank you. Larry, let me bring you in the conversation because your group's model is closer to the independent side of the spectrum without private equity involvement. So tell us about your professional service agreement with Ascension.
So a little background about our group. We, like many cardiology groups, chose the route of employment and ended up becoming employed with a health system in 2011 after having been independent for 40 years. But like some organizations around the country, as leadership changed within that health system, the physicians really found that employment was no longer attractive. In fact, it was very distasteful in terms of the changes taking place, the culture of the organization, their involvement in decisions, and so on. And so they exercised their right to unwind employment and go back to independence 4 years ago. So this was really prior to the emergence of private equity to the degree it is today in cardiology. But in the course of those last 4 years, we established a relationship with Ascension, which is a health system in the area that we historically had not done work at. And we have established what I would call a limited PSA. And the thing we like about the PSA model is it allows our group to stay independent. There is a skepticism about being owned by anybody, given our employment history and unwinding. There's a skepticism about what is the future of private equity ownership when you no longer have input in terms of who will own you in the next iteration of ownership if the private equity organization sells your solution, and they may sell you back to a hospital in a potential scenario. You really may not have any input or say in that. And so we felt that we felt that a professional services agreement was the sweet spot between retaining independence, working closely with a hospital partner, but defining the degree of what that relationship is and making it a partnership. And the PSA model has immense flexibility in terms of what is or isn't included in a PSA relationship, what services are included, what locations are included. And so we feel that a professional services agreement is the right decision at this point in time for this group. And it works well in terms of our partnership with Ascension.
Everyone's a little bit different, a lot to consider. And from just the three of you all, it seems like what you've chosen is working. Ann, tell us about your group's model. Would you consider your practice fully private, independent?
Yes. So VCS is a 40-person group with physician group with 8 APPs, and Richmond is sort of a unique market, I would say. So we are definitely a private group, wholly owned by our shareholders. We have a board of directors that have designated authority, and then reserve powers are left for all the shareholders of things related to capital, hiring physicians, doing new offices. Where Richmond's unique is pretty much all the big subspecialty groups are still independent, and we have probably several hundred primary care that are still independent. And so we have 2 health systems, and it's really hard for, plus VCU, but we have 2 HCA and Bon Secours. And so it's really hard for one health system to absorb, our group in particular, but like Ortho Virginia's probably got 100 physicians, and urology's probably has 50. So we took a different stand. We have looked at hospital integration years ago and decided it wasn't for us. And we've been very happy with how it's all turned out. And we actually formed a partnership with the other specialists in the primary care and formed our own ACO that's been quite successful over the years. And so it allows us to have a partnership with other physicians in the community. We have a good relationship with both health systems, but really have no PSAs or anything else. We are truly one of the dinosaurs, I guess you could say, of being a private practice.
I was thinking that, wow, I mean, that is a very unique place there in Richmond. Joe, let me bring you into the conversation as well. As we have this conversation, is a private equity topic relevant solely for independent practices, or should integrated groups and other ownership models also be paying attention to this?
Yeah, that's a great question, Melanie. Today, a lot of the transaction activity has been the acquisition of private practices, like Ann just described, and Larry before his PSA, and of course, Drs. Pubbi and Snyder before their acquisitions and relationships with PE firms. So that is where the majority of these transactions have taken place. But when you take a look at cardiology, it's roughly 85% already integrated with a hospital or health system and 15% private. So there's only so long that we can go on acquiring private groups. And so the way that hospital systems take a look at their specialty physicians, their cardiologists, really differs across the country. And I think there will be some opportunities for PE firms to partner with health systems to essentially take those cardiologists off the books and find other ways to strategically partner with those health systems. And I believe the long-term platform winners here are going to be the ones that understand how to best partner with the hospitals to access that other 85% of the marketplace. How that's done, what that looks like, who will be successful at that is really to be determined, because we have not seen that happen yet to date. But I think that's on the horizon, and we'll be hearing about that in the very near future.
Yeah, there's just so much to learn, and people have to actually walk these models and see what the best routes are. So Dr. Snyder and Dr. Pubbi, you talked about the choice that you've made and why you all made that decision into private equity. Now let's delve a little further into the pros and the cons, the things that you had to consider before making that decision. So Dr. Snyder, let's start with you. What was on your pros and cons list?
So the pros for our group was to be able to survive. As you know, for an independent groups, it can be challenging because of the issues with site neutrality. Generally, we are reimbursed a third or a fourth of what some of the hospitals will get for some of the same procedures that are done in our offices, even though it looks like our offices are in the hospital. We have issues with recruiting. Many times independent groups cannot offer the same compensation package to new fellows. So that was one of the challenges. And that was one of the more attractive things about private equity that allows you to do. One of the biggest questions I had was in terms of clinical autonomy and governance. And in fact, when we met with most of the groups that we met with, they would say after about the first or second hour, you guys haven't even mentioned one question or had one question about the deal costs. So you've been asking questions about clinical autonomy and governance, which is our number one thing. We are passionately independent. We put a premium on culture, on chemistry, that clinical autonomy and governance. And in fact, that was going to be the sine qua non for us because we did not want anyone telling us how to practice or have shotgun marriages. And our real goal was, from the financial standpoint, to lower the cost of care. And if we can capture some of that lower cost of care, that was going to make us successful. The bottom line is value-based care is a reimbursement model that's best played at scale. The tools that you need to have in your toolbox, data mining, data analytics, it's hard to do that with a 3 and 5 man group. You don't have the administrative bandwidth. You don't have the financial resources. You need that capital and infrastructure administration to be able to do that, to be successful in value-based care. And I'd rather be where the puck's going to be, not where it is. I think everyone sees this for the cost reasons that we've talked about. For me, it provides the best cost-effective model going forward. And as site neutrality begins to take hold, and I think everyone is predicting that, I think you're going to see the employed model being less and less attractive to the CFOs who will, at this point in time, tolerate a $200,000 loss per physician. But on a value-based care model, it's going to be a misaligned relationship. And I think you're going to start seeing some jettisoning of these employed physicians. And I do think if we get enough critical mass, we can go to the hospital systems and say, you don't like doing this. And all the hospital administrators will tell us that. This is not their core competency. They don't like doing it. They don't do a good job at it. Physicians generally are better and more successful. Give that service line management to us. We already do it for a couple of hospitals, but we could do it for various systems and be much more successful at sharing risk as a partner as opposed to an employed model.
All right, thank you. Dr. Pubbi, let me ask you the same question. When you were looking at that list, what was on it as far as what was a deal breaker for this situation, and what were the things that you must have in order for you to say this was a good deal?
I'll share our own personal decision-making policy, what we used as stuff. For us, when we started looking, we took almost 2 to 3 years to process this. It was not like the first thing that came to our side, we said, we're going to do that. We went and talked to 5-6 people, explore the different models and see what works for you, what doesn't work for us. Of course, financial part comes into the picture. Do I have a bandwidth to go more because I have an outreach community where I really want to go and help people? Do I have enough financially resources to recruit another physician? Do I have enough resources to have a low-cost care for the patients? Whether I'm sending the patients to the hospital to get a procedure done, we have a cath lab, we have OBL on our own. We do a lot of cardiac caths there, but we have to go back and talk to the insurance companies and talk to them and say, hey, can you give us a contract to do this procedure at this hospital? But if you're a group of 15 to 20, you only have that much say. If you're joining the private equity company and now you expand it to 100 physicians or 150 physicians, you can go back to the insurance companies as well. Say, hey, I can provide you the low cost care. We'll do a standard of care. We'll do this procedure in the ASC. That'll save you a lot of money. That'll save the patient a lot of money, and that'll be a quick service. Patients don't have to stay overnight. They'll be in and out. Those things that all come into the picture. On the con side, you always have to look and see, are you losing control of what you've always been good at doing? Am I doing a justice to the patient and the care for my own benefit? Or isn't the Hippocrates oath tell me that I wanted to help patients, not otherwise? If you start to feel that, hey, look, if this is going to interfere with my practice or how we practice, that's a no-no for us. You have to have a mutual respect and the mutual decision-making power, because the growth is together. You cannot be I in this thing, you have to be us in these things. Looking at all these things, we cannot do that on our own. But if I have a partner which goes hand in hand with me, which will both grow together and mutually help each other, we providing the cardiology side and other party providing the resources as well as the data analytics side or the value-based care side, that will help us grow together. So that was on my pros and cons list, and that's how we decided that, which handshake we want to go with.
It's interesting because we've had a lot of podcasts talking about value-based care and where this is going and how it truly is the future. And it does seem from your perspectives that you are preparing for that future. And right now you have the skin in the game and you were able to have that negotiation to make sure that you did remain in control and in control of the governance. I wonder if people wait too long and they're kind of forced in the situation, do you feel like they may lose some of the control that you all were able to negotiate?
I definitely think so. The bigger you get, the longer you wait, the more difficult it is to get to that level where you can have a full control of negotiations or even the governance on that level. If you can do the things on your term, it's way easier and it's way better for the practice.
On the flip side, Ann and Larry, what led you to decide not to partner with a PE firm? Larry, let's start with you. A few highlights of the pros and cons on your list.
Well, I think, there were some exciting pros. I mean, I would compare what's going on with cardiology and private equity very much to what was going on with independent cardiology groups and hospitals back in the 2005 to 2010 range, in terms of, exciting partnerships, opportunities to do things together that maybe you weren't able to do. And I think private equity is having the same dialogue. As I said earlier, in our case, what we learned is that those deals can go south because people change, your partner changes. In some cases, the legal language you create can be undone by the person who has reserve powers in the end. And so, we just don't know enough about private equity today. Yeah, and we did talk to a dermatology and radiology and anesthesiology to get an idea in terms of, so what has happened over the course of your 10-year relationship? And, didn't hear enough to say, this is fabulous, heard mixed messages. And so in our case, we looked at, so what are our alternatives, and feel that there's a number of legal models that allow independent groups to thrive instead of being solely independent. And that, PSAs can be one, joint ventures can be one. So part of our PSA is we're building a joint venture ASC with Ascension, co-management agreements. I will say that at least in my neck of the woods, value-based care has, it's a ripple, not a wave. And having not too long ago negotiated all the payer contracts when we restarted as an independent practice 4 years ago, none of the major payers expressed any interest whatsoever in our desire to do any kind of value-based payer arrangement. And much of what I see that's out there from a value-based payer model is still really built on a fee-for-service chassis. And so it remains to be seen whether value-based care will become the reality or just one of many concepts that kind of comes and goes in healthcare. I don't know. And I think we're more inclined at this point to say, let's preserve our options. Let's work with the partner we have. Let's optimize that PSA relationship. But at the end of the day, let's maintain complete control of our independence in terms of our governance, but also our future. You can choose not to renew the PSA. It can unwind in certain circumstances. And so I think we feel better that we're not locked in to any arrangement like we were with employment. Now, we were able to unwind employment, but I think, that's much harder to do, if not impossible to do, in a private equity arrangement. So that's where we stand. And we're much like Ann's community. Most of the specialists in our community are still in independent practices. A big portion of primary care is still in independent practice. And so the independent community really is strong and thriving in Wisconsin, northeastern Wisconsin. And so it makes it a lot easier to stay the course as an independent.
Yeah, Ann, I want to bring you in, fully private, independent, and you talked about how that really truly is working, especially for you in your region. Do you have a highlight of a pro and con list, though, if you really do have to sit down and make a decision about PE?
Well, what we did last fall, because we've been contacted by lots of different brokers and private equity companies, we're probably one of the largest private groups in the state. So I brought in a certified healthcare lawyer, actually out of Florida, to come because he was not selling anything and he'd done a lot of deals. And so he laid out the model, how it generally works. Obviously, the important thing for this group, like Dr. Snyder and Dr. Pubbi said, was governance and physician leadership. So he laid out the model, did sort of a potential financial, presentation, and at the end of it, pretty much unanimous of my 30 shareholders and even young doctors who are on the track said for this year we just opened our own ASC and probably the first in the state for cardiology, and we're putting in a PET CT and looking at some real estate. So they said, let's stay the course. Again, try to get these projects up and going, be successful. We have a value-based contract with Anthem that we're part of the Palette cardiology group with. So we wanted to see how that was going to work out. And then we'll continue to see how the transactions that have transpired are moving ahead. But my young doctors said, let's just stay the course for now. We're doing fine. And we have really strong relationships with both health systems and probably maybe evaluate it again a year from now. But I think they really like feeling like they've got total control, if anybody has total control over the group, and they just have friends who've had bad experiences with PE deals, and just at this point would prefer that we just focus on trying to provide some of these value-added services and really try to make a difference in our own market.
Yeah, definitely an open conversation, it sounds like, from both of you all. Well, boy, we have unpacked a lot. We are going to take a quick pause for a quick message for our Heart Talk listeners, and we will be right back with this very, very important discussion about private equity.
You hear the term care transformation a lot, but what does it mean exactly? Care transformation is redefining the way consumers buy and use healthcare by developing new products, treatments, and business models that integrate separate healthcare organizations or activities. MedAxiom understands that moving the needle in CV care is not simple. It takes vision and leadership, and it requires bridging technology, innovation, and care delivery. MedAxiom experts are helping programs across the country shape the future of cardiovascular care delivery. Through education, organizational performance solutions, and advocacy, we are evolving disease management, innovating virtual care, driving the data revolution, and redefining access and team-based care. Let's transform cardiovascular care together. Get started at medaxiom.com/care transformation.
Welcome back. We have been talking with our 5 thought leaders, each with a unique perspective on private equity. Ann, I want to ask you this question on the minds of many folks, is whether private equity in cardiology will be more helpful or harmful to the patient, and more broadly, the quadruple aim of healthcare: A 2019 paper in the Journal of the American Medical Association concluded this: the increase in private equity investments in healthcare poses risks, including overutilization, practice instability, and patient safety concerns. However, these investments might also benefit patients and bring more efficiency to a system with waste. So what advice would you give your peers as the MedAxiom ACC community awaits more research on this?
Well, much that has been said by the physicians on this podcast, growth of PE in cardiology is still fairly young. So I think you really need to make sure physicians have a lot of control over clinical decisions, ensuring all modalities have some type of QA oversight. I think Dr. Snyder talked about all the data analytics stuff, so you can understand what your cost profiles look like. But the physicians really have to drive the overall clinical experience in order to make sure that the quadruple aim isn't lost, as well as some control over your staff. Because again, if the staff end up not having as secure of an environment in a PE new world as they do working with physicians, then you may have a lot of issues related from customer service and efficiencies and eventually, clinical outcomes. So I think it's always going to come back to having a physician-led governance and the ability to make decisions that really will affect care and the value of the care you're providing.
All right, Larry, let me ask you, Eileen O'Grady, Research Director of the Private Equity Stakeholder Project in DC, very critical of PE. She said in a recent podcast, the private equity playbook is to double or triple your investment over a couple of years. So if we're talking about a traditional private equity firm that has this goal in mind, I don't think there are many kinds of healthcare companies where it's possible without cutting cost in ways that hurt patients and workers. So Larry, let's talk about the alternate ownership models that maybe offer some of the benefits of PE without the potential harms that O'Grady is talking about.
Well, one, I would agree that I think there's a potential risk, and if you study the research that's been done on private equity's entry into healthcare, which is probably much more extensive than most people realize, there's unfortunately a lot of negative stories out there in terms of practices increasing their charges 20%. Some of the research that we did found that in other specialties there was a eventual movement away from physicians being replaced with NPs and PAs, and so I think the jury is out in terms of, can you find a real value add success story that in the long term where private equity has actually brought better quality, better value, if you will, bring the quadruple aim. That may happen, but I'm not sure it's happened for the most part in employed practices, and it'll be determined at some point whether it happened in private equity. But I do still strongly believe that there are other models that can lead you there. And I think one area that is interesting, and it really hasn't impacted cardiology at all, is the entry of payers into practice ownership, or payers into more cohesive partnerships. And as Ann and I can attest, when we're both in communities where a large percentage of the physician base is independent, what has not typically happened, but I think is an interesting opportunity, is can the medical community drive the development of clinically integrated networks, whereas today those are mostly being developed and owned, or certainly heavily influenced by health systems. So I think there's still a lot of options on the table, and it's very community specific. But I think, like anything in healthcare, what is true today or thought to be true today probably isn't going to be the reality 5 years or 10 years from now. And so I think, in my mind, the best thing to do is stay nimble, stay flexible, stay independent, and see how the industry goes, and be able to exercise those options as you see fit. But at the same time, pick the partners that do make sense for you today, because the headwinds for a truly independent practice can be daunting today.
Melanie, if I can just dovetail to that, in Dallas-Fort Worth, we have very large independent practices because we believe, most of the cost savings is really on the specialty side. I think a lot of the value-based models are emphasizing ACOs, but if choosing the site of service truly is that important, not only do primary care physicians not go to hospitals anymore, they certainly don't choose that. In fact, my mantra is site neutrality cures budget neutrality. What the PE in cardiology, what attracted us to this is that you could, if you are spending $300 billion a year in direct cardiovascular services, which is the approximate number, you could save 60 to 70 billion by leveraging value-based care, ASCs, low-cost sites of service, and clinical pathways that have value-based principles. It's going to be that relationship. The principles have to be the same. You still have to have clinical autonomy. You still have to have that governance. We think we can leverage that, lower the cost of care, and maybe capture some of those savings.
So, I want to bring you in. Those are some big numbers to discuss. And this certainly is a very complex discussion about PE, and one size doesn't fit all. And you have to be so educated before you make this deal. So what advice would you give those who might be facing this decision?
Melanie, I think that's a great question. And to answer that, I think I should disclose here that as of the recording of this podcast, we actually have 3 PE partners, Novo Cardiovascular Logistics, and Heart and Vascular Partners. And it's really MedAxiom's desire to leverage these relationships to bring, education to our community on all the different models that are out there. We also partner with West Coast Partners, which is a sell-side advisor. And I really want to disclose that because all of these organizations are important to the MedAxiom community, but they don't influence my advice on this topic. While MedAxiom believes in all of these firms' ability to really impact the market, choosing a partner is a big decision, and it's a one-way street at this point. There's no going back. And so I think my number one piece of advice would really be to maybe explore the use of an investment bank that represents the seller, in this case, the physician practice, to really help them evaluate their options and to help them get the best deal terms for them. I mean, we do this all the time in our daily lives, right? Rarely, if you're buying a home, do you shop one place for a mortgage. And that's a transaction that can be switched or refinanced real easily in the grand scheme of things. We use websites to determine, what appliances to buy, what cars to purchase, or should I go to this concert or not? But that infrastructure isn't there yet for PE firms focused on cardiovascular acquisitions. But an investment bank can really serve as your advisor in this regard. They can help you negotiate deal terms, and they've got years of experience in doing this because there's just not, 5,000 reviews on Amazon for PE transactions in cardiology. And I think going it alone is a really big decision. And I think it can become a really risky endeavor as opposed to a smooth transaction. And so I do think bringing a professional in around something that will be life-changing for you and your practice is an important thing to do. But this conversation has actually made me realize there's another piece of advice, and I'm really just reinforcing this. It's a little bit tangential to using an investment bank, but really it was hinted at by Dr. Snyder and Dr. Pubbi, and I think it's worth repeating that you should really aim your transaction on the alignment with the PE firm in terms of, operations and really protecting your governance ability and your clinical autonomy, as opposed to just the finances. They're both spot on in their assessment of clinical autonomy. And it reminds me of going all the way back to 2008, 9, 10, 11, and 12. And we look at the successful hospital transactions. And those successful hospital transactions, at least anecdotally to me, were really the ones that focused on the autonomy of how they were going to run that group and how they were going to be able to practice medicine. And I think that is the real governing principle here about preserving your quality of life in terms of your professional ability to practice. And the way that we've always said this is if you focus on the finances it'll drive your happiness, one day every 2 weeks or one day a month or whatever payday is. But if you focus on clinical autonomy and governance, it drives your happiness every single day. So I just thought that those were such wise words from Dr. Snyder and Dr. Pubbi that they were worth repeating here, and certainly some of the advice that everybody should take to heart.
Let me bring Dr. Pubbi in the conversation as well, and I want to pose this to everyone. Big decisions here, and regarding the intensity of really a paradigm shift, how does private equity compare to hospital physician integration a decade ago? Joe just touched on it a little bit, but Dr. Pubbi, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I was just listening to the conversation, Dr. Snyder and Joe talking, and the same thing happened 10 years ago. Hospitals started getting into the cardiology network. The biggest difference where I see is, first, financially, it is very feasible and good. You get some equity for the cardiology partners as well, and you have a good clinical control as well as the governance control. Once you're employed with the hospital group, sometimes the expansion pattern is dictated by the hospital practice, and especially like we're in Florida working with 3 or 4 bigger hospital groups in different hospitals we go to, owned by the Baptist, Independent Flagler, Ascension, HCA. So it's much easier as a private equity for me to navigate through these hospitals without particularly assigned or attached to one hospital group as well. And like the cost saving part Dr. Snyder mentioned, that's a big, huge event for procedures to be done away from the hospital into the office or into the ASCs and the OBL. That's a big cost savings for the patients, for the community, and for everybody involved with that.
Dr. Snyder, what are your thoughts when you look at this paradigm shift?
Oh, I think it's going to be very dramatic, and I actually think as the economic models, the reimbursement models change, as site neutrality begins to take greater hold. I think it's already made penetration in terms of the E&M codes. I think it's going to make a lot more penetration in the ASCs and the ancillary imaging. Stenting, for example, in 2022 for 92928 in an ASC, it's $5,618. In the hospital, it's $10,258. During the pandemic, our ASCs were humming when the hospitals were closed, and we were able to pass those savings on. I think you're going to see some of the hospitals look at this as something that's positive. I've had several of the employed doctors. I practice at a medical city, which is an HCA hospital here in Dallas. We have 2 employed groups. Some of the beginning ask questions, not only here, but throughout the state, about how the model works. In fact, I saw just one of the HCA systems in San Antonio 2 weeks ago, signed a joint venture with, I believe it's called North American Anesthesia Partners, which is a private equity group, for them to take over their anesthesia. I can imagine that, expanding to different service lines like orthopedics and cardiology. And I think it could be a win-win for both organizations, to get away from an area that's not their core competency, they don't do well, and the model is not serving them well, and to kind of prepare for the coming, which we see value-based care, and not just in value-based care, but even in a fee-for-service where you can save money. We're going to get this tsunami of patients coming by 2030. 50% of the population will have a BMI of 30, and all the Medicare baby boomers will be on Medicare. We're going to see a tsunami of demand, just as we're going to see the supply of physicians dramatically shrinking, especially cardiologists. So we've got to be able to meet the demand, but in a cost-efficient way. And as advocates for our patients, we got to be focused on that part of the equation. It's not just no longer science and education that determines what kind of healthcare we get. It's the economics and the politics, and we need to be at the forefront of that. And we are best positioned when we are clinically autonomous at the table and it's transparent. We had several doctors during the pandemic that worked for the employed models where they just came in and said, listen, this is a onesie or twosie office, we got to shut it down. They gave them 30 days notice. One guy was on vacation, didn't even know it coming. We had one guy leave, go to an employed model, and come back. In fact, last week we signed 2 doctors last week. One was from an employed model, the other was independent, who knew what we were doing. The one from the employed model, he's doing very well. He would be in the top 20% of reimbursement. And And so, he sees where the future is going and wants to be a part of it.
All right. And let me let you have some final thoughts on this discussion about a paradigm shift.
If I think everything that Dr. Snyder and the physicians have said are very true. I think, for us, the hospital acquisition was just not going to work. They couldn't absorb my entire group. So we had to break the group up to go pick one system over the other. And so if PE is going to be a good solution to allow physicians to truly remain independent, be able to have capital so they can build site of service investments that are going to lower the cost of healthcare and can continue to truly function long term as a true independent group, then it may turn out to be a great opportunity for the country and for all the groups. I think part of the issue is just going to be getting that right partner, and the PE world, as I understand it, has generally always done probably a 5-year investment and then look to flip to get a return on their money. That's where I think it could destabilize the medical community. And so I guess my only thought in listening to all this is, it's going to be, as you say, you got to pick the right partner for the long term and have to have some kind of build in that it's a 10-year or longer commitment. I just can't imagine what it would be like to have go with a group and then in 5 years it's flipped to another group and you've lost all the initial infrastructure that you put in place with the first PE group.
Yeah, that's where a lot of the fear comes from. Larry, I'll let you have the final words on this. Whatever you want to discuss, if it's paradigm shift or you just want to give us some last thoughts on this great discussion today.
Well, in my mind, the big question around private equity is can the owner of these independent practices who has, by nature, a desire for a 25 to 30% return on investment every year, can that work well with a clinical model? Some people would say that hospitals really are functioning similarly to private equity firms because they're desperately chasing, profit margins, and they're, even though they're not for profit, it's really just a tax exempt status. So I think that's the question that is looming in my head and is yet to be answered is, can a desire for return on investment, which is more or less the sole focus of private equity, really coexist and thrive and lead to something better with a clinical model that doesn't necessarily share that as its sole focus and initiative? And I don't know what the answer is. I think we'll figure that out over the next few years, but it is something that worries me because when you read about, how has that gone so far in non-cardiology aspects of private equity's involvement in healthcare, the stories aren't great, and so we'll see if something different can emerge. I love what I hear about maintaining governance and autonomy, but I just don't know if in the long run that will lose out to. But yeah, where's my 25 to 30%? And I need it again next year, and I need it again the year after that. So we'll see.
All right. Well, Ann, Larry, Dr. Snyder, Dr. Pubbi, and Joe, what a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for your transparency, your thoughtfulness in this conversation. I don't know if we solved any problems, but we certainly had a balanced conversation and gave everyone some meaty food for thought as we go down this road. So thank you for your time and your expertise today on MedAxiom HeartTalk.
Thanks, Melanie. Appreciate you having us all.
Thanks, Melanie.
Yeah, great conversation.
It really was. All right. Well, that is it for this episode. If you liked it, please tell your colleagues and let them know they can subscribe to MedAxiom HeartTalk on Apple, Google, or wherever they get their podcast. Also, if you'd like to send us a note directly or suggest a topic, email us at hearttalk@medaxiom.com. Thank you so much for listening today.